Okay, I'm back with another quick take. Let's do that. There we go. Another quick take, another bad PowerPoint. Let's go. This time, is China communist? So this is a subject where when you look online, you either find a lot of A, misinformation, B, limited information, or C, good information but it's far too long. There are a couple of really good books on this out there, but I thought that I'd just create a nice video format going through a little bit of what is socialism, communism, and is it China? So let's have a look. I wanted to start it out with some words from Deng Xiaoping, who was one of the greatest leaders in China, and I would say one of the greatest leaders globally. And he said, when speaking of capitalism versus socialism, he said, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. Essentially meaning it doesn't matter if China or their policies are socialist or capitalist, as long as they're progressing the nation and making the lives of people better, which is true, right? He also said, poverty is not socialism, you're just poor, right? Which is also true. So let's have a look. And that's not to say that he was anti-socialist. A lot of his measures were socialist in nature, and I've read some of his works, and it's very obvious that he was a socialist himself. So who says what? People who are anti the view of China being socialist will say that they are state capitalist. Some of them who are pro the view of China being socialist will say that they are market socialist. In China's name, it says that they are communist, the Chinese Communist Party. And then if you ask Chinese academics, they will say they are they are socialist with Chinese characteristics. So first, let's have a look at some terms. Let's have a look at what is communism. I've said communism versus socialism, but essentially communism versus all of the other systems, going back as far as slavery. So slavery is a system where you go out there, you can buy and sell and own humans, and then the humans can do your bidding. Let's say you want someone to cut you a load of wood, you can go out, buy a human, tell them to chop you wood, and then do that, right? As long as you feed them and keep them alive. Slavery gave way to feudalism, which is essentially you don't buy and sell and own humans, but you buy and sell and own land, and the land comes with people on it. So it's basically slavery with extra steps. Let's say that you wanted some wood, you would go out, you'd buy or you'd own some land, then you'd tell some of the people on that land, hey, I want you to go and chop me wood. And for the people who live on the land, they are tied to the land, and they have to do X amount of their work for their master or for the lord of the land. And then they can spend the rest of their time doing whatever they want, making shoes, growing their own food, whatever. Obviously, it changed from time to time and from place to place, but it was usually like, 4 days you're working for your lord, and then 3 days you can do whatever you need to do to survive. Feudalism eventually gave way to capitalism, and capitalism is, okay, now we can't buy people in any way, but what we can do is we can buy their labor power, we can buy their time so that they can work for us, if that makes sense. Socialists would say that in capitalism, not only are they buying your work, but they're actually exploiting you by paying you less than what you should be getting. Because, for example, let's say you spend an hour to chop down a tree, and that tree is worth £20, but you're only getting paid £10. That means that they're only paying you half of what your labour is actually worth. Right, they're gaining that extra £10 as surplus value, which they end up keeping. So in capitalism, we're kind of done away with slavery. Instead, a person is free to put their labour on the open market and sell their labour, albeit at an exploitative rate, according to socialists. And then socialism is supposedly the next step after capitalism, where people will be able to free themselves from this exploitation. They'll be able to use their own labor power, and the way that they'll do this is capitalists can basically buy your labor at an exploitative rate because they have all of the capital, which is like the machinery and stuff like that, to make it worth it, if that makes sense. So, for example, in the example of cutting wood, let's say the capitalists actually have all the chainsaws, right? So they can buy your labor, and you can't use it without the capitalists because you don't have the chainsaws. But in socialism, the people will seize the means of production, they'll seize the capital for themselves, they'll be able to use the capital themselves amongst each other, and so they'll be able to use their own labor power and get full value for it, right? The surplus value isn't going to these pesky capitalists. So instead of getting paid £10 for producing £20 worth of wood, they'll be able to get the whole £20 themselves, supposedly. Communism is the next step. It's basically socialism in a post-scarcity world where there's no leading state, no class or elites who are going to rule over people. Everyone's equal in that regard, and people will contribute what they can and they will receive what they need. So, for example, if I need wood but I don't have the ability to go and make it, I'll be able to go to the commune, I guess, and take the wood that I need, and those in a position to produce wood will produce it, and yeah. No one is at a space where they are communist, because this goes off of a couple of assumptions. First, that we're in a post-scarcity world, and also it only works if it's a global movement, right? You can't have a bunch of people who are communist and a bunch of people who aren't communist. So essentially, communism is like, it doesn't really mean anything. If someone says I'm communist, it's more theoretical than practical, right? Like, socialism versus capitalism is like straight versus gay, for example, but being communist will be like saying you're pansexual, right? You can say that, but it doesn't really exist. No one's out there having sex with pans. Obviously, that's a joke. I have a lot of sex with pans. Anyway, so we're going to look at some of the aspects of socialism and see how China sees themselves fitting these aspects. First one I've already mentioned is seizing the means of production. So the underlying issue that socialists would need to get over in order to create a socialist society would be to bring the means of production, bring the capital under the ownership of the common people, right? Because it's the capital that gives the capitalists the ability to go out there, buy labor, and use it, and gain that surplus value from the labor. So the way that China sees themselves seizing the means of production is through the state representing the people and the state owning the capital or owning the means of production. And this is primarily through state-owned enterprises. So if you think about, for example, in a lot of countries, the state will own natural monopolies like water or rail or electricity. Not in my country, because they're absolutely madmen here. But in most countries, that's the case. China's gone even further. They're actually just owning, companies which aren't even natural monopolies, just companies where everywhere else it would be owned by the private sector. So, like, for example, like phones and EVs and solar panels and all of this stuff. And then I've put some figures on here where you can see a very considerable amount of companies are owned by the state fully. A lot of them are owned partially. and I think in total 68% of all capital belongs to firms which are fully or partially owned by the state, and that was back in 2017. Now it will be a lot higher, because since then there has been a big push for China to become quote unquote more socialist by owning more of the means of production. And I think that obviously there's a little bit of mental gymnastics to be had here, because if the state owns it, is the state a good organization to be representative of the people? Or will it just be that instead of the companies exploiting people, the state is now exploiting people? But this way of interpreting socialism is how most socialist states operate. It's how the Soviet Union, the USSR, used to operate, with the government being the representative of the people and seizing the means of production. And it means that even if workers are having their labour power exploited and having that surplus value taken off of them, that's going to the government, who can then reinvest it into the people or siphon it back. And the government can also make decisions as well on behalf of the labour. So that's how they see themselves being socialist. The next one is, how are they preventing the rate of exploitation? So we used the example earlier. It takes an hour to cut a tree down. Tree's worth £20, but you're only getting paid £10. So how do they get around this aspect of capitalism? Well, the first thing is, one thing that I would say about China is they study all types of theory intimately. They're just huge nerds, right? I think that stereotype is quite true at a government level for China, right? They study everything, and like what Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter if it's black and white. The same with their policies, right? If they see something in capitalism which will benefit them, they will adopt it. And I think that's one of the things that they've done here is, some people say that China is better at capitalism than the capitalist countries, and that's because stuff like competition they push for heavily. They make sure that every single industry, every branch has multiple different companies who are competing. They deliberately kind of prop up underdog companies. They make sure that there's no monopoly in any of the industry. They make sure that there's regional competition as well, and that way they try and push the profit margins down as low as they can. And in addition to this as well, they're constantly investing and subsidizing the companies. And yeah, all of this is to try and push down the profit margin. And their way of thinking is, well, if someone's being exploited where they're only getting, their £10 for their work, but if competition is so fierce, then the companies aren't going to be able to charge the full £20 for the tree, right? They're going to have to charge, let's say, £12. So even though the worker's not getting paid as much as they should do, everything is cheaper. So it's like kind of two wrongs making a right in a way. So that's all the way that they see it. Average company profit margin in China is like 5%. In the UK where I'm at, it's somewhere between like 13 and 15%. So you can see that things are a lot cheaper because not as much money is going to the stuff like profit margins. They've also done a lot to prevent financialization of their system. There's a lot of regulation around like stock buybacks and dividends and all of this stuff. And that's to kind of stop that siphoning of exploited value going up to the rentier or the capitalist class. In addition to that, because a lot of these enterprises and companies are part or fully owned by the state, it means even when profits and exploitations are made, it's going to the government, which is meant to be representative of the people who can then reinvest it into communities and society, whatever. So again, some mental gymnastics, but that's how they see themselves fitting there. And the last one, this is actually quite a complex piece of socialist theory to understand, but I wanted to include it as well because it's quite interesting. But perhaps if we go to the last bullet point first. Essentially, labour theory of value, which I've spoken about previously, which is a classical theory on how the value of items is determined. Earlier I said, it takes 1 hour for a tree to be cut down. That means that tree is essentially worth 1 hour's worth of work and would be worth the same as any other item which also takes an hour to produce in totality, right? So let's say it also takes an hour to make a kilo of salt. That means a kilo of salt and a tree should have the same value. So that's the labour theory of value. And it says it means that all profits are basically surplus value, like I mentioned, derived off of exploiting the labour of workers. Again, we'll use that example. Someone spends an hour to chop a tree down, they get paid £10. The capitalist sells that tree for 20, so they're basically getting exploited by £10. Here I did some different numbers, but yeah, let's just use these. So 10,000 a year to chop down 20,000 worth of trees. Let's say that the capitalist is investing in each of these workers $100,000, and that's going to like the chainsaw and whatever other equipment is needed. That means for that $10,000 of profit or surplus value, they're having to invest $100,000. So that means that their rate of profit is 10%. So rate of profit and profit margin are two different things. Don't get them confused. Profit margin is obviously how much you're making or selling something versus the cost of producing it. Here, rate of profit is basically how much profit you are getting for how much you invest. So I'm investing 100,000 into each worker, and I'm getting 10,000 profit from each worker. So that means my rate of profit is 10%. Now, in socialism, there's a theory called the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, or the falling rate of profit, which says that unless the population grows at 10% in this example, then if I keep investing the whole 10% into my business, the population has to grow at least 10% to allow that. Otherwise, I'm essentially going to run out of people to invest in, right? If I'm investing 100k in each worker, it requires there to be those workers for me to invest in, right? But if my profit is growing at 10%, but the population is only growing at 5%, it means that I'm not going to have workers to invest in, I'm not going to have demand for my product, etc. So it means that my rate of profit essentially must fall. The only thing that I could do is perhaps invest more into each worker to make them even more productive. So perhaps instead of giving each worker $100,000, I give them $200,000 to get them one of those cool like cars that cut down trees and faster than a chainsaw. But if I'm investing $200,000 per worker to get $10,000 a year from that worker, it means that my rate of profit is now 5%, not 10%. Now at this point you'll probably say, yeah, but if you're investing $200,000 per worker, making them more productive, let's say to make it easy, twice as productive, it means that now your worker, instead of cutting down one tree every hour, is going to be cutting down 2 trees per hour. Well, the issue is the labour theory of value says that if a worker now is cutting down 2 trees per hour, that just means that the price of trees is going to be half. If I was going to take my trees and trade it for salt, instead of trading one tree for a kilo of salt, I'd have to now charge 2 trees for a kilo of salt. Because what determines the value of my trees is how much labor time it takes to create that tree. So yeah, I'd be investing $200,000 per worker for that $10,000 a year. So my rate of profit would 45%. And the the tendency is that to always happen unless the population can outgrow the rate of profit. And this probably sounds extremely theoretical, and when I first was learning it, I was thinking this surely has no real world application. But actually it does. Here are some charts that Paul Cockshott, who's a really good professor, put together, where he took a calculation, and on the other screen I have the calculation here. The profit prime is the growth of the workforce plus the rate of technological progress plus depreciation of capital stock divided by the share of profit accumulation. So he actually took this equation and he applied it to different countries, and his theory was that the rate of profit would follow this profit prime. And here are 2 examples of what he did. Here you can see it with Japan. So the dotted is the expected, and then the thick line is what happened in reality. And you can see that in reality it is indeed following the expectation or the profit prime. And then on the right is the same exact thing, but with Britain. And again, you can see that what happens in reality, the rate of profit follows the profit prime. The reason why these, on a side note, the reason why these two look so different is because in Japan they have had a falling population. They also have had a significantly high rate of accumulation as well, reinvesting their profits into business. Whereas in Britain we've done the opposite. We've had a fluctuating and mostly increasing population, but we've also had periods where we aren't investing or reinvesting our profit back into our industries as well, which means that our rate of profit has been able to remain higher, which sounds really good, but the long-term result is that we've become less competitive as well. But anyway, so really deep socialist theory here that we've dabbled into, but what does it mean for China? So the best way to tackle the issue of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is to increase the workforce size, a little bit like how Britain has done, albeit through immigration. Or you could decrease the rate of accumulation, so decrease how much of the profits are being reinvested into companies. Again, we have done that. Or you can increase the rate of technical progress, which is what the likes of Japan have been trying to do. Or you could also increase the amount that the technology depreciates as well, which the only way you could really do that, I imagine, is through the likes of war. But the biggest issue with the rate of profit falling is if you have an ever falling rate of profit, then people are going to be less likely to invest in these companies, because you're investing even more for less profit, especially when there's options where you can just throw it into a financial market and speculate and get even more profit, and then in the long run that just means your country becomes uncompetitive, which is one of the reasons why Britain is. So China recognized this, and what they do is they, through the government, push an insane amount of investment and subsidies into their companies, even recognizing that the rate of profit is going to fall, but they still continually push that investment into their companies, and they also put more into research and development than any other nation as well. And perhaps we'll explore it in another video. But this, mixed with their extreme competition that they have, just means that they end up actually exporting deflation. Previously, I said that the US exports inflation to the world, which is obviously really bad for the world. Well, China does the opposite. They export deflation because everything that they touch just becomes so much more efficient and so much cheaper. Look at, for example, EVs, solar panels, TVs, pretty much everything that is produced out of China, the prices for them have been going down, whilst everything else, the prices have been going up. And the West absolutely hate this. They call it overcapacity, but it just means, cheaper prices for everyone. The last piece that I wanted to look at is democracy of the worker. Socialism isn't just about the economic aspect, it's also about the democratic aspect. It's about each worker having the ability to have a say in what goes on, how their labor is used, what the environment is like. And in China, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see any way where there's a direct workplace democracy where, like, people within a company can vote who the leader is, and like a co-op, for example, and vote on policy, etc. But instead, the way that they do it, again, is the state representing the people. There are officials within the government that represent each of the major industries. So, for example, if I'm a woodchucker, I don't know what the actual term is, but if I'm a woodchucker, there will be someone from the woodchucking industry representing our interests within the government. But in addition to that, this as well, because the government owns so many of the enterprises, or at least has a stake in the majority of the enterprises, it also means that they can make decisions and vote on stuff which would effectively impact the worker. So it's not really a direct democracy, but they see themselves also being able to dictate or make decisions for the worker. Again, a little bit of mental gymnastics, but so are they socialist? Firstly, I would say that no one is purely socialist or capitalist. It's kind of, I mentioned earlier, gave the analogy of gender, but it's kind of true. It's basically a spectrum, right? And no one's fully socialist, no one's fully capitalist. Everyone will suck a dick in the right scenario. But the most we can do is compare how do they compare to other socialist countries. Let's first look at some old and some newer examples. So we'll go with USSR. And here we're using our the scale is black and white cat, black being socialist, white being communist. And we can see that USSR, I would say, were very, very socialist. They were Marxist-Leninist socialists, which is the same way that China is, where the state is meant to represent the people. So that was their interpretation and their rollout of socialism. They were very rigidly socialist. They even let labor theory of value dictate a lot of things. They centrally planned everything, including the prices. They didn't leave that up to kind of competition and market forces. So yeah, there was a little bit of white there, but mostly black. Yugoslavia, I would still say very socialist, not as rigidly socialist as the USSR was. Yugoslavia also had, I would say, a more literal understanding of socialism. they had a very beautiful system where instead of the state representing the people, it was actually the local communities and the individual companies, and they basically ran as like a collection of co-ops that competed on a market. But each co-op was democratic. People had a say in what happened, who led the company, where profits were allocated within communities as well. Let's say that the companies made profits, they'd be able to say, okay, what do we want to do? Do we want to build a park in our local community? Or so it was a more literal understanding in that you didn't have this government acting as a third party representative of the people. The people would actually have more power within their workplaces and communities. I speak to a lot of people from ex-USSR and ex-Yugoslavian states. I actually toured around all of the Yugoslavian countries, and what's surprising is whenever I speak to any of these people, they always look very fondly of the socialist era, and they always see it as kind of the best era and better than what they're living through currently. There are exceptions, big exceptions, but are like Polish people, Czech people as well. But for the most part, especially when I travelled around the Yugoslavian countries, all of them were saying, it were the best times. And unfortunately, with Yugoslavia, they had a lot of outside meddling, interests outside of their country that didn't want them to continue with their experiment. It led to financial manipulation, NGOs creating tensions, and ultimately led up to the illegal bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO. But it sounds like a shame, because it sounds like people over there wanted that to continue, and from what I hear and read about it, it was quite a beautiful system. But anyway, that was a tangent, but still a pretty black cat. Vietnam is kind of between the two in how they approach socialism. They do have collective farms, co-ops, but they do also have this kind of state representation as well. So they're kind of in between the two. They're still very socialist, I would say. There is more market forces dictating terms within Vietnam. But very socialist from what I've read and seen. And they're also doing really well for themselves. Like, Vietnam has been through such a rough time. They've been destroyed by the likes of, France, the US, China, everyone just absolutely pummeling them. And they've bounced back and created and are creating what seems like a really beautiful society for themselves. So good on them. Venezuela, everyone always hears Venezuela's socialist, blah, 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 blah. They're not. Like, if they're socialist, then I don't know. I don't know. These guys are as The reason why people say they're socialist is perhaps their politics want them to appear so, but mainly because they have nationalised their oil industry, much to the chagrin of the likes of the US, who want it to be exploited by Western companies. But that's basically as far as they go in terms of socialism. Whereas capitalist is the next step. So all of that, our conclusion: how white or how black is this cat when it comes to China? Let's finally find out. Fuck!